So just this past Halloween, I went on one hell of a rant about modern-day Universal Monster movie reboots and remakes, pushing for reimaginings that at least attempt to capture the atmosphere of a traditional monster movie. And speak of the devil himself, here comes Dracula, the Netflix series. Dracula has always seemed to be the go-to target character for reboots. For some reason, he's perceived as the most versatile Universal monster. I guess Frankenstein and the Wolfman feel too restricted. You can't really give them any new abilities, you can't add to the mythology, and any remakes that did took it way too far over the top anyway. Funny enough, before I discovered there was a Dracula Netflix series, I was put on to the Netflix Castlevania anime series, and as I've said before, Castlevania to me really seemed to have kicked off the trend of making Dracula more than just a vampire. In these games, and certainly now in this series based on the games, he is the devil himself in human form with a range of different abilities, and while I prefer the idea of Dracula just remaining a fucking vampire, I'll loosen up a bit and be realistic about the times. They need to upgrade the character to keep him interesting, which is what they do in both Castlevania and the live-action Netflix series. And I can live with that as long as a series or reboot movie does everything else they can to keep the original feel, vibe, and atmosphere of a Dracula movie. And you know what? I gotta say, I think the Dracula Netflix series seems to have all that covered. The first thing to note is these episodes are overbearingly lengthy. Each episode is an hour and a half, which is the length of most feature films, so being that I'm a busy guy, I did not have a chance to watch more than the pilot episode. And since the pilot episode is the length of a movie, I'm almost viewing this entire first episode as its own movie, like a 2020 remake of the original Dracula, which it really seems to be anyway. Even though it's a device to kick off an entire series, it starts by remaking the original in the most traditional way I've ever seen attempted, in the respect that it represents scenes, dialogue, and the basic plot of the original 1931 Dracula, so now it's got my interest. Especially because the recycled dialogue from the original shows respect for the franchise and the iconic film that started it all. The new dialogue is creepy and memorable, and I would say quotable. Many times throughout the episode I repeated a line back to myself like, wow, that leaves an impression. The horrific phenomenon of Dracula has been put into new words that differently articulate his appeal and terror. This is what a remake is supposed to do. And for any monster kids watching thinking, fuck this, nothing beats the original, and I'm not open to any sort of remake or reimagining to begin with, you can tune out. That's not what we're here to discuss. If you're a Dracula fan, you can watch the original until you're blue in the face, which I have, but also be open to new fresh takes on the character and story, which I'm all for, as long as it's done with homage and respect. Now we lived through every variation of Dracula imaginable. The novel version, the original story, the origin story. We've seen films that clearly wanted to use the name, but tell an entirely different tale. Now let's at least be open to a series that seems to want to do Dracula justice. A big thing for me was they balanced the gore pretty well, not too much, not too little, right where you need it to be, and it does rely more on creepy subtleties than jump scares. As I've said, much of the dialogue is effectively responsible for that alone. Netflix was also a great choice for introducing a new generation of Dracula. I know this also premieres on BBC, but I always rolled my eyes at people who blindly assume a new reboot means a new audience. When Hollywood remakes a Universal monster movie, trust me, kids do not rush to the theater. And I feel like Netflix has a reputation, much like HBO or AMC, for producing shows that tell great stories. And I think that draws a lot of people in alone. They may not necessarily be interested in Dracula, but they're like, let's give it a chance, it's Netflix. Netflix always does right by us. So for once, I actually believe a new generation is truly being introduced to Dracula. I don't think the audience for this show is going to be made up of monster kids alone. In fact, they'll probably reject it, which is fine. I'm 24 years old, Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee are dead, and I want new Dracula movies. Let's talk about Dracula's look. When he's first revealed, he's a sickly-looking, washed-up old creature. As he feasts on his first victim, the fresh blood gives him new life as he progressively takes on a more youthful appearance. When he's more middle-aged looking, there's a shot of Dracula that really looks very traditional, like the Hammer horror Christopher Lee Dracula. I even love the face he makes, which is very monster movie-esque. Once he's fully rejuvenated, he's more youthful looking, and that's where I was kind of like, I prefer the middle-aged look better, but whatever. I can't say this is the best Dracula with the most commanding vocal inflection, but I'm also aware that it would be silly to imitate the Lugosi or Christopher Lee delivery because the way they dragged out their speech worked for the times, but would now seem dated and cheap. He's good, but nothing special. I guess what I do like is this Dracula doesn't try to be anything but what we know Dracula to be. Charming at times, threatening other times. And this Dracula balances that as well as he can. But it's hard not to compare him to the Draculas we've seen before to make a proper judgment alone. I know he's better than John Carradine and every Dracula from the 90s and early 2000s I've seen, so I suppose I'll let it rock. The character who was supposed to serve as Renfield under a different name for some reason is fantastic. I love the way he is visually transformed into the dead after falling victim to Dracula. There's a moment where he's speaking to a nun and comes to a realization. He says, "I'm not breathing," to which the nun replies, "You have no heart rate either." That's genuinely creepy. Dracula has been given a range of new abilities, one of which being able to take on the form of not just a wolf or a bat, but other people and the rest of the undead, much like what Freddy Krueger or Pennywise would do to more effectively prey on their victims, which is like, alright, it's cool. All I can tell you is this entire first episode really did it for me. It hits the atmospheric notes with the castle, the bats, the howling wolves, the gothic scenery, the eerie sense of sacrilege, the retelling of Renfield's arc from the original, and the performances are top-notch. The only thing that kind of confused me is this badass nun with fantastic dialogue, who Dracula eventually refers to as Van Helsing. Is this Van Helsing's daughter, a relative of Van Helsing? Should I have continued watching to find out? Or is Van Helsing now a woman? I mean, whatever the case, this nun Van Helsing is badass. I'm not usually down for updating the race or gender of a character simply because that's not staying true to who a character is, but a good performance like this and fantastic dialogue can make it not feel like this update was solely for the purpose of drawing in a female audience or appeasing everyone, and it didn't. I'm all for everything I've seen so far, and hopefully each episode gets better and better. If only they weren't so damn long. The only good thing about these lengthy episodes is that each one is like its own movie, and as it stands right now, I believe there's 3 episodes, so you can look at this as a new trilogy of Dracula movies, which is pretty cool. One headline I read said Netflix's new Dracula series proves that vampires are back in, and that's what I like to see. I'm hard on horror remakes, guys, but this one has the vibe of an homage to Universal and Hammer movies, which I like, so it's got my stamp of approval. I'm Kevin Savo. Let me know what you thought of the new Dracula series, and for more content like this, subscribe to my channel. We'll see you next time.